On December 7, 1941, the Japanese would carry out a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And the next day, the United States Congress would declare war on Japan, officially entering World War II. As a result, the Hawaiian Islands, along with several other parts of the U.S. West Coast, were placed under martial law. Hawaii would remain under martial law for nearly 3 years and 6 months, a significantly longer period than any other state on the mainland. How did martial law come to be imposed on Hawaii? Why was it maintained for so long? And what did life look like under martial law in paradise? This is Rogue History. In order to understand what happened in Hawaii, we must first look at the situation unfolding on the mainland. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of fear that the west coast of the United States would be attacked next. In fact, just 2 days later, on December 9, 1941, the U.S. military began to seize all coastal areas west of the Rocky Mountains. These military zones included parts of California, Oregon, and Washington, stretching all the way down to Mexico and up into Alaska. Military authorities claimed these actions were necessary to protect against potential enemy attack. However, many suspected another motive for military intervention, namely the large number of Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. Many military officials believed that these Japanese Americans could potentially be disloyal to the United States and were looking for an excuse to remove them from their homes. And so while Hawaii was not under any imminent threat of attack, military authorities used the martial law powers granted to them following the declaration of war to take control of the islands. On December 7, 1941, military governor Joseph P. assumed command, and the next day the Stars and Stripes flew above Iolani Palace where he would set up his headquarters. The civilian government was dissolved, and the military now ran all aspects of the islands. The military government took several immediate actions after assuming control. They issued orders closing all public gatherings, suspending civil court proceedings, and dissolving both the legislative and judicial bodies of the territory. Hawaii's territorial constitution was suspended, and the following day, December 10, 1941, all able-bodied men between the ages of 18 and 65 were ordered to report to induction centers. A curfew was imposed from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. and travel between the islands was forbidden without a permit. Food and gasoline were rationed, and strict limitations were placed on the sale and transportation of commodities deemed essential to the war effort. For example, gasoline sales were forbidden unless one had a permit, and non-residents were prohibited from purchasing any gasoline at all. The military also heavily censored the press and mail and even required newspapers to submit their stories to military censors before printing them. All telephone calls and telegraphs were also subject to censorship. As historian Robert W. Frawley wrote, if a local resident wished to send a message to someone outside the territory, he or she could write it out but had to wait until a military censor approved its dispatch. The military government went as far as requiring all residents over the age of 6 to get fingerprinted. They also barred anyone from leaving the territory without a permit, which made a visit from family on the mainland a rare occurrence. These policies were all designed to ensure the safety and security of Hawaii in the face of a potential Japanese invasion. But it also created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty among the civilian population. In addition to these measures, the military also took action against those suspected of disloyalty. Over 700 people of Japanese ancestry were arrested without warrants. Many of these individuals were community leaders, business owners, and professionals. They were held in internment camps without charge or trial, often for years. Additionally, military authorities closed all Japanese language schools and prohibited the teaching of Japanese language and culture. They also forbade the use of the Japanese language in public. Any radio broadcasts in Japanese were banned, and it was illegal to speak Japanese in public. Access to places of worship was restricted for those in the military, as they were prohibited from attending services in any place of worship. As martial law continued throughout 1942, things only got worse. On May 27, 1942, the military government issued an order barring all fishing within the territorial waters. This order caused significant hardship for many native Hawaiians who relied on fishing to supplement their income. The order was eventually rescinded in July after the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determined that the martial law restrictions were unnecessary and burdensome. But this was one of the few instances in which the military government took into consideration the impact of their policies on the local population. For the most part, the military government was unsympathetic to the plight of the Hawaiian people and continued to impose harsh restrictions on their lives. Trials that took place under military tribunal were often very quick affairs. The military courts were designed to be efficient and decisive, and trials were often completed within a few hours. Defendants had little time to prepare their cases and were often denied the right to counsel. Habeas corpus, a legal action that allows a person to challenge their detention, was suspended, meaning that people could be held indefinitely without charge or trial. This led to numerous cases of alleged mistreatment by military authorities. Many accused the military of using torture and other forms of coercion to extract confessions. There were even reports of people being killed in custody. As historian David M. Kennedy wrote, the military government's heavy-handed tactics created a climate of fear and resentment among the civilian population. People were afraid to speak out against the military government for fear of retaliation or arrest. In some ways, the military government's policies were discriminatory. They targeted specific groups, such as people of Japanese ancestry, as well as those who were critical of the military government. For example, in January of 1943, a group of Hawaiian nationalists known as the Friends of Hawaii marched on the governor's office to protest the military government's policies. They were demanding the restoration of civil rule and the release of those who had been arrested under martial law. The march was met with a violent crackdown by military police. Several protesters were arrested and charged with crimes such as disorderly conduct and obstructing the military. One of the protesters, a young man named John L. Haina, became a symbol of resistance to the military government. He was convicted of attempting to overthrow the military government and sentenced to 5 years in prison. However, the prosecution's case against him was weak, and he was released after serving only 18 months. Haina went on to become a prominent figure in Hawaiian politics. As the war dragged on, the military government's policies became increasingly oppressive. Curfews were extended, rations were tightened, and civil liberties were curtailed. By 1944, the Hawaiian people were growing weary of martial law. They wanted their civil rights restored, and they wanted the military out of their lives. This sentiment was reflected in the election for non-voting delegate for the U.S. House of Representatives in Hawaii. The delegate seat had been established in 1941, but due to martial law, no elections had been held. In 1944, voters overwhelmingly chose a candidate who campaigned on a platform of restoring civil rule. This sent a clear message to the military government: the people of Hawaii wanted to be free from martial law. And so in late 1944, martial law was gradually lifted. In July 1943, civil courts were restored, and the governor's power was returned to the hands of the elected officials. But it wasn't until October 24, 1944 that martial law was finally lifted. By this point, the war was nearing its end, and the threat of Japanese invasion had long since passed. The military government had served its purpose, and it was time for the Hawaiian people to take back control of their lives. In the aftermath of World War II, the Hawaiian people began the long process of rebuilding their lives and their communities. The scars of martial law and the internment of Japanese Americans remained, but the people of Hawaii were resilient, and they worked hard to put their lives back together. This has been Rogue History. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content. Thank you for watching. The attack on Pearl Harbor was one of the most traumatic events in American history. And in the immediate aftermath, the federal government imposed martial law on the island of Oahu to ensure the safety and security of the territory. But this drastic action had a profound impact on the civil rights of the people living there. So what happened to their rights when martial law was declared? Let's find out. So just after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the order imposing martial law in Hawaii. Under this order, the civilian government of the territory was dissolved and military authorities assumed complete control over all aspects of civil life. Now, martial law is a temporary form of government that may be imposed during emergencies or war to maintain order and security. It allows the military to take over civilian functions and enforce strict controls over the population. However, it also suspends certain civil rights and liberties. And in Hawaii, the impact on civil rights was significant and far-reaching. The first major impact of martial law was the suspension of constitutional rights. The Hawaiian Constitution guaranteed certain fundamental rights and freedoms to the residents of the territory, such as the right to due process and equal protection under the law. However, under martial law, these constitutional rights were suspended and residents were subject to military law instead. For example, one of the most important civil liberties suspended under martial law was the writ of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is a legal action that allows a person to challenge their detention and requires the government to justify their imprisonment. Without this right, residents could be detained indefinitely without trial or the opportunity to challenge their imprisonment in court. Additionally, under martial law, trials were conducted by military tribunals rather than civilian courts. These military tribunals were not bound by the same rules of evidence and procedure as civilian courts and often resulted in rapid and unfair trials with high conviction rates. For example, many residents were convicted of disobeying curfew orders or of making critical statements about the military, which might not have been considered crimes under ordinary law. This lack of due process meant that residents did not have a meaningful opportunity to defend themselves against charges or to appeal their convictions. Another way in which civil rights were impacted was through the imposition of strict curfews, blackouts, and travel restrictions. These measures were intended to prevent enemy attacks and aid the military effort. However, they also severely restricted the freedom of movement and daily life for residents. For example, strict curfews were imposed on the population, which prohibited them from leaving their homes at certain times. These curfews were often changed with little notice and severely disrupted daily life for residents. Travel restrictions were also imposed, which limited the ability of residents to move freely within the territory. This made it difficult for residents to travel to work, visit family, or even leave the island. These restrictions were particularly burdensome for essential workers who needed to travel to keep the economy running. But overall, the impact of these restrictions was felt by everyone living in Hawaii. In addition to these restrictions on movement, martial law also led to censorship of the press, mail, and other forms of communication. The military authorities imposed strict censorship policies to prevent the release of information that could compromise military operations or aid the enemy. This meant that newspapers and magazines were heavily restricted in what they could publish, and many critical voices were silenced. The military also censored the mail, which allowed them to open and inspect letters and packages. This intrusion into private correspondence had a chilling effect on freedom of speech and privacy. Residents were afraid to express their opinions or even discuss sensitive topics in their personal letters for fear that they would be intercepted and censored by the military. One of the most controversial aspects of martial law in Hawaii was the requirement that all residents over the age of 6 be fingerprinted and registered. This measure was intended to identify and control the population and was particularly burdensome for Japanese residents who were seen as potential enemy sympathizers. The military argued that fingerprinting and registration were necessary to protect the security of the territory and to identify potential threats. However, critics argued that this measure was a violation of civil rights and a form of racial profiling. The fingerprinting and registration of Japanese residents in particular was seen as a form of surveillance and control and was a manifestation of the deep-seated racism and xenophobia that existed at the time. This policy resulted in the creation of a database of information on the residents of Hawaii, which was used to monitor their activities and enforce the restrictions imposed under martial law. The military also used this information to target individuals for detention and internment if they were suspected of disloyalty or subversive activities. Under martial law, the military assumed control over many aspects of the economy, including work hours, wages, and the operation of businesses such as bars and restaurants. This intrusion into the economy had a significant impact on the civil rights of residents and allowed the military to further regulate and restrict daily life. For example, the military imposed strict regulations on work hours, which limited the ability of businesses to operate and the ability of residents to work. These regulations were intended to conserve resources for the war effort, but they also had the effect of restricting the economic opportunities for residents. Additionally, the military set minimum wage rates for workers, which were intended to ensure that workers were paid a fair wage. However, these wage controls also restricted the ability of employers to hire workers and contributed to unemployment. The military also regulated the operation of bars and restaurants, which limited the hours during which they could serve alcohol and the ability of residents to gather in public places. These measures were intended to prevent drunkenness and disorder, but they also restricted the ability of residents to socialize and enjoy their freedom of movement. Now let's look at the impact of martial law on different groups of people. As mentioned earlier, Japanese residents and other so-called enemy populations were particularly affected by the restrictions imposed under martial law. In Hawaii, this group included people of Japanese, German, and Italian descent. From the start of martial law, they faced severe restrictions on their movement, association, and even livelihood. After Pearl Harbor, many schools serving Japanese students were closed. And in February 1942, the Superintendent of Public Instruction ordered that all Japanese children be withdrawn from private schools as well. By March, all Japanese children were out of school. Their parents were also subjected to curfews, travel restrictions, and forced labor. Many of them lost their jobs, and their property was confiscated or deeded to the U.S. government at low prices. For example, many Japanese farmers were forced to sell their land to white landowners at a fraction of its value. Some of the proceeds went to pay for the internment of the farmers in U.S. government camps, while others simply disappeared. In fact, despite being loyal American citizens, many Japanese Hawaiians were forcibly relocated to mainland internment camps. In total, more than 70,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated in these camps during the Second World War. In contrast, the impact of martial law on white residents in Hawaii was much less severe. White residents were generally able to continue their lives with few of the restrictions that were imposed on Japanese and other minority residents. For example, white residents were not subject to the same level of surveillance and control and were generally free to travel, associate, and work as they pleased. This disparity in treatment resulted in a sense of injustice and resentment among minority residents who felt that they were being punished without cause. When martial law was finally lifted in Hawaii in 1944, it marked the end of a long and difficult period for the people of the territory. During this time, their civil rights and liberties had been severely restricted, and many of them had suffered greatly. The legacy of martial law in Hawaii serves as a reminder of the importance of protecting civil rights and liberties. It also highlights the need for transparency and accountability in government. The imposition of martial law in Hawaii during World War II was a drastic measure that had a profound impact on the civil rights of the people living there. The suspension of constitutional rights, the imposition of strict controls on movement and association, and the targeting of minority groups for special restrictions all contributed to a climate of fear and uncertainty. Despite the hardships they endured, the people of Hawaii showed great resilience and determination in the face of adversity. They continued to fight for their rights and freedoms and ultimately emerged from this difficult period with a renewed sense of community and solidarity. If you want to know what the Japanese internment was like, click here. And don't forget to subscribe for more updates. See you next time. Okay, so let's talk about martial law in Hawaii from 1941 to 1944. As a reminder, this is part of our series on martial law around the world and through history. You can find more information below. I'll be following my usual format for these videos, starting with a brief overview, then talking about the legal changes martial law brought, how it was implemented, how people responded, and finally, how and why it ended. So martial law was declared in Hawaii shortly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. At that time, Hawaii was a U.S. territory with its own constitution and laws and, most importantly, its own elected civil government. But the military quickly took over. The first martial law proclamation was issued by the commanding general of the Hawaiian Department, Lieutenant General Kruger, on December 8, 1941. That same day, he turned over control of the islands to the military governor, Lieutenant General Delos Emmons, who had been the commanding general of the Hawaiian Department until just a few days before, when he was reassigned to become commander of the 8th Army. So what did martial law mean for the people living in Hawaii? Well, it meant that their lives were now under the control of the military. Under the martial law proclamation, all civil government functions except those essential to the public welfare were suspended, and military authority became supreme over the entire territory. So the military governor basically got plenary power to do pretty much whatever he wanted, as long as he claimed it was necessary to suppress the invasion or rebellion. One of the biggest changes brought by martial law was the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, which is a legal action that allows a person to challenge their detention and requires that the government prove in court that they have a lawful right to keep that person locked up. The suspension of the writ allowed the government to arrest and detain people without charging them with a crime or giving them a trial. The military governor was given full power to prescribe the area or areas where persons could be arrested and detained if he believed it was necessary to protect against espionage, sabotage, or other threats to military operations. He could also require people to report to local draft boards and denied the right to counsel in hearings before being relocated. The military also took over the courts and other parts of the criminal justice system. The Supreme Court of Hawaii and the territorial courts were immediately closed, and civilian judges and lawyers were prohibited from practicing. All criminal cases pending in the courts were transferred to the military. The military established its own system of justice in Hawaii, which was separate from the civilian courts. Military commissions, also known as tribunals, were set up to try people accused of crimes against U.S. law. Provost courts were created to try offenses against Hawaiian law. Many of the cases heard by these courts involved violations of the law, such as curfew violations, failure to register for work, or refusal to follow orders. But thousands of civilians were also tried by military tribunals for offenses under federal law. One defendant may have gotten only 1 minute of trial, according to a Honolulu newspaper account from 1943. A witness testified, and the defendant was found guilty and sentenced to 3 months in jail. According to the reporter, the trial lasted less than 5 minutes. That sounds like pretty quick justice. In addition to the changes to the courts, martial law also led to the suspension of many constitutional rights. For example, President Roosevelt issued an executive order closing all civilian courts and suspending the right to a jury trial by a vote of 6-3 by the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Duncan v. Bonfield. Other changes included a ban on grand juries and on appeals of convictions to higher courts. In practice, this meant that there were no real protections against wrongful convictions or mistreatment. Defendants had no right to counsel, no right to confront witnesses against them, and no way to appeal their conviction to a civilian court. They also couldn't challenge their detention unless they could get the writ of habeas corpus reinstated, which was very unlikely. Outside the courtroom, life under martial law was also very difficult. As you might expect, there were harsh curfews and even blackouts at times. The military also censored the press and other communications. People were required to turn in their radios and were forbidden from talking about military operations or even owning cameras or binoculars. There were even special blackout window markers so that residents could obscure their lights in case of an air raid. Mail was censored and people needed permits to leave their homes. One of the most visible aspects of martial law was the extensive use of military checkpoints and roadblocks. Homes were subject to search without a warrant, and people could be stopped and questioned without reasonable suspicion of wrongdoing. Many businesses were closed and thousands of people were put out of work. Men were not allowed to grow their beards because it was considered a security risk. Martial law also brought special restrictions for people of Japanese ancestry. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government began arresting people who were suspected of being disloyal or subversive, mostly people of Japanese ancestry. The military governor ordered the Japanese population to report for fingerprinting, and the military confiscated property from people suspected of disloyalty. More than 7,000 people were arrested under martial law, and many of them were sent to internment camps. Schools were also closed, and all instruction in Japanese or any other foreign language was banned. The children of Japanese immigrants were forced to give up their citizenship in order to avoid deportation to Japan. The closure of the schools was part of the effort to assimilate Japanese children into American culture and prevent them from becoming too attached to their Japanese heritage. It was also intended to control the flow of information into the camps and prevent Japanese Americans from receiving news of the war or developments in the Pacific. So how did people respond to martial law? Well, as you can imagine, many people were unhappy with the restrictions on their civil liberties. But they were also afraid of what would happen if they resisted. After all, they were living under military rule, and the military had the power to arrest and detain anyone it wanted. Despite these fears, some people did speak out against martial law. For example, one lawyer wrote to the Honolulu Star-Bulletin protesting the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. He argued that this action was a dangerous precedent that could be used to take away civil liberties in time of peace. Another resident wrote to the editor of the same paper criticizing the closure of civilian courts. He argued that this move was a threat to the fundamental principles of justice and the rule of law. While there were some isolated protests and acts of resistance, there was no organized opposition to martial law. The vast majority of people simply tried to comply with the regulations and hoped that the war would end quickly. So how and when did martial law end? Well, as it turns out, martial law was never formally lifted in Hawaii. Instead, it was gradually suspended starting in July 1943. Most of the major changes brought by martial law were reversed in steps over a year and a half. In October 1944, the military governor returned full control of the courts to the civil government. But he continued to exercise some powers until May 1946. Those powers were finally surrendered to the civil government on June 19, 1946. So, why did the military eventually give up control of the courts? Well, it was probably because the situation in Hawaii had changed. When martial law was first declared, the U.S.